Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kirk Cousins. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 15 tight end and quarterback rankings for the 2022 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, we're covering all topics related to the tight end and quarterback positions, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses have been giving up the most points to opposing tight ends and quarterbacks since Week 7 in order to give ourselves more perspective as to the most advantageous matchups and which of these matchups we might want to avoid based on how well these defenses have played against said positions. Then we'll transition into talking about our top 16 tight end and quarterback rankings, as I'll share with you guys my opinions on the matter and, of course, the statistics that justify the reasons as to why I want to play these specific tight ends and quarterbacks. Before we get into today's video, there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot of statistics that I've collected because it's the fantasy playoffs. Again, win and move forward or lose and go home. So we want to go ahead and set you up for the most possible success, giving you as much information as possible so you can make the right decisions. Now, speaking of making decisions, let's talk about tonight's Thursday Night Football game between the Seattle Seahawks and San Francisco 49ers. The only adjustment I wanted to make, because I went ahead and I told you guys in the comment section yesterday that I would in fact be making adjustments to Kenneth Walker, and I would mention it in the beginning of today's video. I have adjusted Kenneth Walker by putting him at my number 18 overall ranked running back. With so much fluctuation in terms of running back, with Brian Robinson being questionable, with Ramondre Stevenson potentially coming back, with J.K. Dobbins not looking like his full self, there is a potential in which Kenneth Walker could be more valuable than all those guys going into this given week. I've moved him to my number 18 spot in a half PPR scoring format, but let me just go ahead and first and foremost tell you, proceed with caution. The fact of the matter is, Kenneth Walker is a running back. He gets majority of his fantasy statistics on the ground. He will very rarely and very seldom get a high reception game. He's done it before earlier this season, 8 targets, 6 catches. Pretty good yardage count against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, in which they pretty much stopped him from running the ball for majority of that game in Germany. But even though that past performance exists, it doesn't mean that we're going to see that out of Kenneth Walker going into tonight's game. They're taking on the toughest matchup of the running back position. I'm not even talking about running back position as a whole. I'm talking about rushing statistics allowed, where he thrives the most. The San Francisco 49ers, like we talk about every single week, are one of the best outside of probably the Tennessee Titans and the Baltimore Ravens over the course of the last couple months here. Because of that fact, again, he's in that middle of the RB2 conversation. If he could break out a big run, if he can get a goal line opportunity, if he can fall into the end zone, we're talking about him being a decent option. Outside of that, I think it's very dangerous to potentially start him, especially on a Thursday game. Luckily, he did end up missing last week so that, he's fully fresh and at a full capacity. And because of that, I have him as a middle of the pack RB2. Hopefully, he can be even better and finishes the RB1 on this given week. That's the hope. Every single running back plays out of their mind, but based on the current circumstance, I have him at number 18 going into tonight. Speaking of tonight's game, after the Seattle Seahawks take on the San Francisco 49ers, I will be here live streaming on the channel. So if in fact you guys want to go ahead, swing on by, ask questions in regards to Week 15 and setting your lineups, be sure to swing on by. Of course, to be notified when I am live, be sure to click the notification button. Subscribe if you have not yet already. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season with the singular goal of trying to help you win a 2022 fantasy football championship. Thank you very much. Also, speaking of tonight's game, if you guys haven't yet already, check out PrizePicks. At this current moment in time, PrizePicks has a current promotion called the 12 Days of Pickmas, where every single day there is a new potential entry that you can go ahead and make and take advantage of. As of today, we have the misses clause, in which you can go ahead and get a protected play, which consists of either winning or getting your money back up to $20. So you can go ahead, check that out today, take advantage of it, travel to their website, whether it's on your Android device, iPhone, on your computer. There's a link down in the description. You can go ahead, use promo code Andrew today when you sign up and make that first time deposit, because when you do, your first time deposit is immediately doubled up to $100. Check that out today. Take advantage of the misses clause. Thank you very much. All right, let's go ahead and let's get into talking about tight end rankings going into Week 15, beginning with matchups. As you can see to the right of me, we have how many points defenses have been giving up to opposing tight ends in a half PPR scoring format, meeting everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard league or a full PPR league. As you can see immediately to the right of me, the Arizona Cardinals, the Jacksonville Jaguars, Los Angeles Rams, Miami Dolphins, they have been giving up the most points to opposing quarterbacks since Week 7. And in majority of these scenarios, about 7 games, considering a lot of these teams have faced bye weeks since Week 7. Nonetheless, we want to take advantage of those matchups. Now, with that being said, we're talking about players like Greg Dulcich, Dalton Schultz taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars. Of course, there's a reason why he's the thumbnail for today's episode. There's a lot of potential for him. Robert Tonyan really can't do anything against the LA Rams. Dawson Knox, hopefully he can stay consistent, play well against the Miami Dolphins. But on the other end of the spectrum, teams like the Buffalo Bills, Indianapolis Colts, Cleveland Browns, we got to be careful of. Cleveland Browns is an interesting one because, again, Mark Andrews has to take on this defense and hasn't really been a viable, fantasy option in quite some time. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Either way, giving you guys these statistics on screen so you can refer back to them. I will also refer back to them over the course of today's video, but just wanted to give you some perspective on the matter. Let's go ahead and let's transition into talking about our top 16 tight end rankings, beginning with our number one, Travis Kelce. Again, Travis Kelce, 3 consecutive weeks of only 4 receptions is putrid, let's be honest. Travis Kelce is supposed to be a guy that could very easily score himself 15, 16 plus fantasy points every single week. He hasn't been that as of late. That being said, once you go ahead and draft Travis Kelce or trade for him, in whatever circumstance in which you brought him onto your team, you have gone ahead and signed a contract with the fantasy gods, knowingly or not, that you must start him every single week. So in that current circumstance, of course, you're starting Travis Kelce. He's the best tight end in the league, the highest scoring one. And of course, hopefully, against the Houston Texans, could put up a pretty good performance for us, especially in the fantasy playoffs. Moving on to our number 2, Mark Andrews. All right, so here's the issue with Mark Andrews. Earlier this season, he took on the Cleveland Browns back in week 7. He had a 0 reception game, only 2 targets in that game, played 88% of the offensive snaps. That all being taken into account, obviously he was dealing with his injury at the time, the knee injury that was bugging him, but playing 88% of the offensive snaps and not getting any production, that is very concerning. That being said, over the course of his entire career, he has always played extremely well against the Cleveland Browns. From 2019 through 2021, he has played against his team 6 times. In those games, averaging 8 targets, 6 catches, 73 yards, and a receiving touchdown per game, which is 17.25 fantasy points per game and a half PPR scoring format. I'm hoping that Mark Andrews with Tyler Huntley can get back on track and put together a big performance here going into the week. Moving on, let's talk about Dalton Schultz, the thumbnail for today's episode. In last week's game against the Houston Texans, in the 2-minute drill, about 55 seconds left on the clock, runs a skinny post over the middle in between 2 defenders, has the ball literally in his hands, drops the touchdown. Should have had himself an 18-point performance at the minimum. That being said, he's going to continue to get red zone looks, and that is the best part of Dalton Schultz. Even though there are other contesting options like an Ezekiel Elliott and or Tony Pollard, Dak Prescott continues to go back to Dalton Schultz. Since week 7, since we have seen the return of Dalton Schultz and Dak Prescott as a duo. In those 7 games, Dalton Schultz averaging 6.5 targets, 4.6 receptions. We have 50 receiving yards per game and 0.43 receiving touchdowns, which is a 9.86 half PPR fantasy point per game average. They take on the Jacksonville Jaguars, who just this last week gave up a total of 11 receptions and 113 receiving yards and a touchdown to opposing tight ends. Even a couple weeks prior to that, we saw Oliver and Andrews from the Baltimore Ravens combined for 8 catches, 126 and a touchdown. Even Kelce and Gray from the Kansas City Chiefs combined for 9 catches, 107, 2 touchdowns. Even Greg Dulcich, all those weeks back, 4 catches, 87. There's a lot of potential to be had in said matchup. We're absolutely starting Dalton Schultz. Moving on, let's talk about George Kittle. I'm a little bit worried about George Kittle. Last week had his lowest ADOT of the season with a 2.8 average with Brock Purdy. Obviously, it's not great. That being said, with Deebo Samuel out, Brock Purdy's going to have to look elsewhere. And I'm expecting Brock Purdy to play very well tonight against the Seattle Seahawks defense that could absolutely be taken advantage of, especially when we're talking about tight ends up against this defense. We've seen a lot of tight ends play well against them. Most recently, Las Vegas, 3 catches, 33 and a touchdown. Arizona tight ends, 5 catches, 40 and a touchdown. New York, 4 for 68. Los Angeles, 5 for 63. Arizona again, 7 for 70. We have seen yardage and receptions be continuously gained. It's just a matter of whether George Kittle can get the job done after the catch and whether or not that ADOT is a little bit more extended than it was last week. And I'm hoping that's going to be the case because in the last 3 games that we have seen George Kittle play up against the Seattle Seahawks in his career, 9, 10, and 12 targets, highly utilized and in the game plan. The last game most recently, 12 targets, 9 catches, 181, 2 touchdowns, week 13 of the 2021 season. I'm hoping to get back to that level. Moving on to David Njoku, our number 5. All right, so here's the thing about David Njoku. A couple things I wanted to mention. When we have Deshaun Watson in the lineup and David Njoku is a healthy, active participant, he is going to be a stud. We talked about this in the preseason, guys. In 2020, Deshaun Watson with his tight ends in Houston targeted them 100 times for 75 receptions, 913 receiving yards, 7 touchdowns. You go back to 2019, Deshaun Watson with his tight ends in Houston. 96 targets, 65 receptions, 605 yards, and 9 receiving touchdowns throughout that season. Of course, the 31 total games that he played in Houston pretty much gets you an average of his tight ends getting about 6.3 total targets, 4.5 receptions, 52 receiving yards, and 0.5 receiving touchdowns per game. Overall, incredible numbers across the board. I'm expecting to see David Njoku continue to be a consistent option for fantasy purposes. Just got hit with the healthy tag. I expect him to be a great play going into the week. Not to mention, Cleveland has usually found a lot of success at the tight end position going up against the Baltimore Ravens. Let me primarily give you some examples. Last season, week 12, against Baltimore, we saw the combination of Austin Hooper, Harrison Bryant, and David Njoku combined for 6 catches, 85 and a touchdown, 17.5 fantasy points against Baltimore. Even after, 2 weeks after that, 2021 week 14, Cleveland Browns versus the Baltimore Ravens. Tight ends, 5 catches, 30 and a touchdown, 11.5 fantasy points. I'm expecting a big week here. from Kevin Stefanski scheming up some plays for David Njoku. Moving on, let's talk about TJ Hockenson. I mean, again, TJ Hawkinson's been one of the most consistent tight ends since he has arrived in Minnesota. From weeks 9 through 14, averaging 8 targets, 6 catches, 50 yards, and only 1 touchdown since arriving there. That being said, 8.7 fantasy points per game on average in a half PPR scoring format. I know it's a difficult matchup going up against the Indianapolis Colts, but quite frankly, with the target volume that he is seeing in comparison to majority of the tight end position, he has that much more of a higher potential for upside on a given weekly basis because he's continuing to see opportunities. Again, I mentioned it all the time. Opportunities lead to success in fantasy football. The number one way to score more fantasy points is get more touches, and that's exactly the advantage that Hockenson has over majority of the tight end field. Moving on, let's talk about Dallas Goedert. The expectation is that he should return this week. I don't know at what capacity, could be limited. He is designated to return. From weeks 1 through 10 prior to his injury, was averaging 6 targets, 5 receptions, 60 yards, and catching about 1 touchdown every 3 games, with a 10.21 fantasy point per game average. As of right now, the Eagles offense is on a roll, having scored 40, 35, and 48 total points in the last 3 games. If Dallas Goedert's active and ready to go against the Chicago Bears defense, who is giving up almost 15 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends on a weekly basis since week 7, it's an automatic play. Moving on to Cole Kmet. Speaking of the Chicago Bears, this is going to be a fun matchup because Cole Kmet, even though it isn't the easiest matchup in the given week, he's the number 1 receiving target of this offense, and he's going to get himself his granted targets that are pretty much an automatic. From weeks 8 through 13 with Justin Fields as the active starting quarterback in those 5 games, averaging 5.2 targets, 4.0 receptions, 47 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown per game with a 12.84 fantasy point per game average. We're in a position where Justin Fields had a full participation in practice today, and we are trending towards the direction in which, of course, Cole Kmet is a must-start going into the given week. I would even flex him if you had one of these other tight ends because I truly believe that he is going to find success in this given week, even though the Philadelphia Eagles haven't given up many points to opposing tight ends as of late. Who have they really played? New York, Green Bay, Indianapolis, Washington, Houston. Not great tight ends. But when they've played against Tennessee as of late, 8 catches, 94. When they've played against Pittsburgh as of late, 5 catches for 60. They've given up points when the tight end position within an offense is heavily utilized, which in the case of Cole Kmet is certainly the case. Moving on, let's talk about Pat Freiermuth. Speaking of the Pittsburgh Steelers, Pat Freiermuth will probably have either Mitchell Trubisky and or Mason Rudolph at quarterback, most likely Mitchell Trubisky in this given week. Of his overall 6 performances this season in which he's been able to surpass 10 or more fantasy points, 3 of them have been with Mitch Trubisky, 1 coming off this last week where he scored a touchdown. If in fact we're going to continue to see heavy utilization of the tight end position in Freiermuth because of the quarterback switch, hopefully he can be an even better play besides being a weekly start. Moving on, let's talk about Evan Engram. Listen, Evan Ingram's performance was legendary. Let's just go ahead and call it like it is. 15 targets, 11 receptions, 162, 2 touchdowns, 33.7 fantasy points. When I went back and I looked at the history of fantasy football in a half PPR scoring format, Evan Engram ranks as the 10th best fantasy tight end performance ever since 2003. I mean, he's behind the likes of guys like Travis Kelce, Kittle, Antonio Gates, Rob Gronkowski, TJ Hockenson earlier this year. I guess technically Taysom Hill earlier this year. There's been a lot of explosive performances this season from the tight end position alone, but nonetheless, the 10th best tight end performance of all time with 33.7 fantasy points in a given week since 2003. Now, just to put this in perspective, the 33.7 fantasy points he had last week literally counts as 31.4% of this season's total fantasy points that he has contributed as a tight end. He went from being the number 15 overall tight end to number 4, just in one performance. Again, I don't think he's going to be able to duplicate this. That being said, maybe there's a little bit more momentum going in his direction, more opportunity, because they believe that he is certainly an option that they want to go ahead and continue to utilize. We know that Doug Peterson, he has a track record for utilizing tight ends. We just didn't expect 15 targets to be the case last week, and that's certainly a difference maker. But going into this week's matchup against Dallas should be a decent play. Moving on, let's talk about Chigoziem Okonkwo. So here's the thing about Okonkwo. Even though he's had himself an incredible performance last week of 15.5 fantasy points, I wanted to do a little bit of digging. In the last 3 weeks, weeks 12 through 14, the tight end position for the Tennessee Titans has garnered a 33% target share, has garnered 40% of the overall passing completions, 39% of the total passing yards, and 33% of the passing touchdowns coming from the direction of Tennessee Titans quarterbacks. That all being said, that pretty much totals 32 targets, 25 receptions, 272 yards, and a touchdown. 47.7 fantasy points. Of all those total statistics, Okonkwo really only attributes 16 of those targets, which is 50%, 13 of those 25 receptions, 148 of those 272 total yards, and 1 for 1 of those touchdowns, 29.3 of the 47.7 fantasy points. Again, over the last 3 weeks, nearly a 10-point, fantasy point average for this tight end, the young rookie. Hopefully, they continue to utilize him. He's getting good opportunity. It's not at a high enough rate. Austin Hooper is still an active participant, but he's still a decent option. Moving on, let's talk about Dawson Knox. Dawson Knox had himself a great week. Congratulations, Dawson Knox. Can you do it again? It's an incredible matchup going up against the Miami Dolphins, who are giving up 12.33 fantasy points per game since week 7. Most recently, a lot of great performances. Jordan Akins, 5 catches, 61 and a touchdown. Harrison Bryant, 3 catches, 15 and a touchdown. Cole Kmet, 5 catches, 41, 2 touchdowns. Hockenson, 3 catches for 80. Pat Freiermuth, 8 catches for 75. The tight end position has dominated up against the Miami Dolphins as of late. Hopefully, Dawson Knox can be another one. Moving on, let's talk about Gerald Everett. Now, Gerald Everett wasn't able to take advantage of that Miami matchup last week, but still got himself 8 targets, 5 catches, 28 yards. The average depth of target not up there. The yards after the catch certainly not there. But nonetheless, Gerald Everett still an active participant in terms of targets within said offense, even with a guy like Keenan Allen garnering 14 targets each of the last 2 weeks and the return of Mike Williams. This all being said, he takes on Tennessee. We understand that the legendary performance of Evan Engram is that alone, a legendary performance. I don't expect Gerald Everett to be able to elevate to that level. That being said, we've seen besides Jacksonville having, 188 yards and 2 receiving touchdowns, we've seen 4 catches, 60 yards from Philadelphia and 6 catches for 57 from Cincinnati Titans up against this defense. So what we're expecting is probably one of those kind of games. Maybe he gets 50 yards on a couple catches. If he does, fantastic. Outside of that, the upside is purely related to whether or not he scores a touchdown. Moving on, let's talk about Greg Dulcich. With the quarterback switch from Russell Wilson to, of course, Brett Rippon, I'm expecting to see a conversation here where Greg Dulcich is still relevant, primarily because, again, earlier this season, when Rippon came into the starting conversation against the New York Jets, when Russell Wilson was obviously dealing with a little bit of a quad injury, we saw 9 targets, 6 receptions, 51 receiving yards from Greg Dulcich, 8.1 fantasy points. In week 14, once he came into the game, Greg Dulcich didn't see any opportunity, but that being said, there still is potential for him to be a pretty good option going into this week. Moving on, let's talk about Tyler Conklin. Had himself 8 targets this last week. Pretty good number. 5 catches, 28 yards. Pretty much the exact same scoreline, exactly, of Gerald Everett. Okay, if that's going to be the case, and now you take on one of the best matchups of the given season, going up against the Detroit Lions, who have heavily struggled against the tight end position. Most recently, Minnesota tight end, 6 catches, 77. Jacksonville, 633 and a touchdown. Kmet, 4 catches, 74, 2 touchdowns. Green Bay tight ends, 9 catches, 89 yards. Gesicki, 338 in a touchdown. Dallas tight ends, 8 catches, 61 and a touchdown. I can keep going. The tight end position has slaughtered the Detroit Lions defense. I'm expecting Tyler Conklin, with the fact that, the Detroit Lions run-stop defense has been as great as it's been over the course of the last month. And Mike White has thrown the ball quite literally 101 times over the last 2 games and not thrown a single passing touchdown. We could potentially end up seeing Tyler Conklin find himself a sneaky touchdown by the end of the week. Moving on, let's talk about Juwan Johnson. Juwan Johnson's kind of snuck past everyone. If in fact he was dropped in your league, let's not forget a couple weeks back, he had himself a 5-game streak in which he scored 5 touchdowns. In 4 of those games, more than 11 half PPR fantasy points. Now, in the week where Taysom Hill had himself a vertical receiving touchdown, Juwan Johnson was inactive. And if in fact Juwan Johnson will be inactive, then Taysom Hill can take this spot. But at this current moment in time, Juwan Johnson, if active and healthy, should be a pretty decent play considering his red zone utilization. Now, speaking of Taysom Hill, most recently, I have been given some information in regards to the eligibility of a quarterback / tight end that is not by the name of Taysom Hill. In fact, the name of Jeff Driskel. Going into last week, of course, Jeff Driskel had tight end and quarterback eligibility. And what he went and ended up doing is putting up a passing touchdown with 38 passing yards, 7 rushes for 36 rushing yards, and 9.12 fantasy points in a 4-point per passing touchdown league. I'm not 100% saying that he is going to be the starting quarterback for this team, but he could continue to see utilization at this capacity. And if that's going to be the case, by all means, Jeff Driskel could be a sneaky play to start an extra quarterback in your roster. If Davis Mills is going to struggle and they're going to bring in Jeff Driskel and they're going to utilize him in the capacity of getting him running, why not go ahead and just think about it? I'm not saying he's a play. I'm just saying be aware that this exists on Yahoo formats. Let's move on. Let's talk about the quarterback position, beginning with matchups. As you can see to the right of me, of course, the Minnesota Vikings continue to be the worst defense against the opposing quarterback position, followed by the Arizona Cardinals, Jacksonville Jaguars, Tennessee Titans over the course of the last 2 months here since week 7. While on the other end of the spectrum, we have teams like the New York Jets taking on Jared Goff. That's a tough one. Houston Texans taking on Patrick Mahomes. Good luck to Houston Texans secondary. The Philadelphia Eagles taking on Justin Fields. Luckily, Justin Fields is going to be able to run the ball. The statistics on screen only isolate passing statistics alone. So when we take that into account, Gives us a little bit of an understanding as to what exactly we can anticipate going into the given week from our quarterbacks. Obviously, not giving us the full argument, but giving us a spectrum and or variable of potential possibilities when we're predicting potential future successes or failures of quarterbacks. This all being mentioned, we'll refer back to these statistics over the course of today's episode. Just wanted to continue to give you guys these updates as we continue. All right, let's begin with our number one quarterback going into the given week. It is Jalen Hurts. For the last 3 consecutive weeks, he's put up 29.8 or more fantasy points in each of those games. Pretty much 30 fantasy points per game in each of the last 3 weeks, as this Philadelphia Eagles team has been tearing through opposing defenses. In 7 of his last 8 games, he has passed for 2 or more passing touchdowns, and in 9 consecutive games, he has scored 2 touchdowns total. He is an unstoppable force at this current moment in time. This team continues to be the best in this league, and the offense, of course, led by Jalen Hurts, continues as such for fantasy purposes. Moving on, let's talk about Josh Allen. He takes on the Miami Dolphins defense in week 3 against the Miami Dolphins. 400 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 47 rushing yards for 26.7 fantasy points. It was in Miami, and now that they get to play in Buffalo. Cold weather, definitely below freezing weather, and it's going to be in a conversation here at home. Does he have the advantage? Absolutely, especially up against Miami, who does not play well in cold weather scenarios. We may be in a situation here where Josh Allen's going to be able to carry you to the next round by himself, assuming he's able to get his arm going and, of course, get his legs into the end zone. With Cole Beasley being added into this conversation going forward, it only makes Josh Allen a better fantasy prospect for the quarterback position. Moving on, let's talk about Justin Fields. Again, many of you guys don't really understand. Every week I have him highly ranked. It's because of what he can do on the ground. What he does through the air is fantastic. And I'll give you some perspective. Over the course of the last 8 games that he has played, since week 5, he's been averaging a 65.6% passing completion percentage, 178 passing yards, and 1.4 passing touchdowns per game. Again, those aren't the greatest numbers for the quarterback position, but what he's able to do on the ground makes up everything. 12 attempts per game, 95 rushing yards per game, 1 rushing touchdown per game for a 26.1 fantasy point per game average. Unbelievable statistics. Justin Fields is on a streak like no other. He's continuing to put up incredible numbers, and at this current moment in time is an automatic start regardless of what defense he plays against. Great, he plays against Philadelphia. Philadelphia probably comes out and gets an early lead. Garbage time fantasy points are fantasy points nonetheless. I'm expecting Justin Fields with a huge performance this week. Moving on to Patrick Mahomes, taking on the Houston Texans. Again, anytime a quarterback is taking on the Houston Texans, there is a potential in which the blowout could serve in scoring less total fantasy points. That being said, in the case of Dak Prescott last week, it wasn't a blowout. And Dak Prescott still wasn't able to score as many fantasy points as we would have liked, mainly because the rushing game for Dak Prescott stole a lot of his overall opportunity. 2 rushing touchdowns, 1 from Pollard, 1 from Zeke. That makes a difference. But in the case of Patrick Mahomes in an offense that very rarely finds rushing touchdowns from other options, Pacheco, of course, as of late has scored, but that mainly hasn't been out of necessity. They don't need the running back position to continue to score touchdowns. All they need is Patrick Mahomes to be down in the red zone, the best at the position down in the red zone, continuing to find success. I'm expecting him to put up a high volume of fantasy points going into the given week. Moving on, let's talk about Justin Herbert taking on the Tennessee Titans. We just saw Trevor Lawrence finish as the QB1 against this defense last week with a boatload of yards through the air and dominating. Now, if in fact we can get any semblance of Justin Herbert stepping up to that level of success, coming off a week in which he himself had 367 passing yards and 1 passing touchdown against the Miami Dolphins defense, a much more difficult matchup, but going up against Tennessee with Keenan Allen back and Mike Williams back. Again, both these guys in week 14 combining for 20 targets, 18 receptions, 208 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. I'm expecting a huge performance out of Justin Herbert against the defense that, quite frankly, stops the run better than just about anybody except for the San Francisco 49ers and will force Justin Herbert to continue to pass. Let's move on to our number 6. It is Joe Burrow. So here's the thing about Joe Burrow. In his 13 games this season, he has had himself 65 rushing attempts, 234 rushing yards, and 5 rushing touchdowns. Earlier this season, he explicitly told the Pat McAfee show that he is going to run more this year. He feels more comfortable with his knee, obviously a couple years removed from the ACL injury that he sustained in his rookie year. That being said, when you're getting so much of your fantasy production on the ground and have the upside of getting yourself a rushing touchdown, on top of the fact that 10 out of his last 11 games, he has had 2 or more total touchdowns, the consistency continues to be there. He's coming off of a performance that is underwhelming in comparison to what we expect Joe Burrow to put up. But you got to remember, there was no T. Higgins or Tyler Boyd for the majority of that game. And Hayden Hurst. If you get all 3 back this given week against Tampa Bay's defense, Joe Burrow should be a fantastic option in the matchup. Moving on, I'll talk about Geno Smith. I love Geno Smith. He is a fantastic fantasy quarterback that has come out of nowhere this season and continues to be a consistent option. The last 7 consecutive games, 2 or more passing touchdowns. 11 of his 13 games this season, 2 or more passing touchdowns. Against an incredible run-stopping defense, it will force them to pass the ball more, especially if, in fact, the San Francisco 49ers mount a lead. And when they do, will force Geno Smith with Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf to score a lot of fantasy points in the second half. Moving on to Dak Prescott, our number 8. Dak Prescott is in a position at this current moment in time that, again, he doesn't need to find statistical success for this team to win. He needs the defense to play well, and they need to run the ball well. He'll get his job done, and when he does, again, sometimes it'll be a 3-touchdown game, sometimes it'll be a 1-touchdown game, and that inconsistency will certainly be there. But if, in fact, the Trevor Lawrence of last week shows up and is able to put up a high volume of points and make this a competitive matchup in which it forces the Dallas Cowboys to have to continue to throw the ball, especially considering Dallas' secondary has been dealing with a couple injuries at cornerback and safety, this could force a lot of passing air raid from the Dallas Cowboys attack. They brought in T.Y. Hilton exactly for that. I'm hoping that Dak Prescott can put together a pretty good week here for us up against an advantageous matchup. Moving on, let's talk about Trevor Lawrence. Speaking of the matchup, if the same guy from last week shows up again, a guy that we have seen, I guess sparingly this year. Sometimes he has great games, sometimes he's not great. Sometimes he'll show up and have a great performance against the Los Angeles Chargers or against the Baltimore Ravens, and then the following week completely disappears. Hopefully the right guy shows up, the right Trevor Lawrence, because if in fact he does, this is going to be a very exciting competition between these two teams who can quite frankly both boat race one another and have this be a higher scoring 30+ point game. And in terms of fantasy purposes, will lead them to being fantastic plays in the given week. Moving on, let's talk about Kirk Cousins coming off a 400 passing yard week and 2 passing touchdowns against the Detroit Lions. Again, it was a fantastic matchup, and now he goes up against quite arguably one of the tougher matchups of the given week, going up against Stephon Gilmore, Isaiah Rodgers, Kenny Moore, a pretty good secondary there in Indianapolis. If in fact Gus Bradley has his gentlemen ready to go, this could slow down Kirk Cousins. That being said, the receiving threats that he has, the offense that Kevin O'Connell has put together, gives me a little bit of hope that Kirk Cousins can have himself a decent week. I'm not expecting a high upside game like last week where he was finishing within the top 5 of the quarterback position, but certainly as a QB1 at the end of this week's standings. Moving on, let's talk about Daniel Jones. Speaking of being a QB1, Daniel Jones has sneakily, consistently been in this conversation over the course of the entire season. Even though he does have inconsistencies, the fact that his rushing potential continues to get him into this conversation is incredible. Over the course of this season alone, averaging 6.52 rushing fantasy points alone. Pretty good statistics across the board, on top of the fact that we're continuing to see him get himself at least 1 passing touchdown each of the last couple games, whether it is to an Isaiah Hodgins and or a guy like Richie James Jr. Now, going into this weekend's matchup against the Washington Commanders, of course, we've recently seen these two teams play. They tied. In that contest, we saw Daniel Jones put up 17.1 fantasy points, 200 passing yards, a passing touchdown, 71 rushing yards. He'll continue to work on the ground, continue to get domination through the air, and at this point, be a pretty good fantasy option. Moving on, let's talk about Deshaun Watson. Continuing to build more, trust in me in terms of his fantasy potential. They do take on the Baltimore Ravens. It is not an easy matchup in terms of their secondary, in terms of having to run the ball in this defense. But if in fact the running game can show up for the Cleveland Browns, it is only going to help Deshaun Watson that much more in terms of the play action ability, because we know that the rapport already exists with guys like David Njoku and Donovan Peoples-Jones. And once in fact Amari Cooper is healthy from his hip injury and can get full utilization and opportunities going in his direction, I'm expecting Deshaun Watson to completely transform this offense into being one of the higher scoring offenses in the league, because we know his potential on the ground and through the air. This current moment in time in QB1 going into the week. Moving on, let's talk about Mike White. They do take on the Detroit Lions. It is one of the easiest matchups you could possibly ask for. As of 9 of the last 11 weeks, the Detroit Lions defense has given up 2 or more total touchdowns to opposing quarterbacks. Mike White is coming off of 2 games in which he has totaled for 101 passing attempts and 0 passing touchdowns. Eventually, it's going to go his way. I'm expecting Garrett Wilson, Elijah Moore, maybe Corey Davis active this week, but Tyler Conklin to help him achieve this goal of being a pretty good fantasy play in the given week. Moving on, let's talk about Taylor Heinicke taking on the New York Giants. Just a couple weeks ago prior to his bye week, 275 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. We talked about the success of Terry McLaurin up against the New York Giants secondary. Taylor Heinicke since 2021, 2-0-1, an undefeated record up against this defense. And of course, the New York Giants, as of late, their defense has been struggling, which has primarily led to the fact that they've lost 4 out of the last 6 games. I'm expecting Tyler Heinicke to be a pretty good option within the given week. Moving on to the rookie quarterback, Brock Purdy. Brock Purdy in the last two performances, whether it was up against the Miami Dolphins and or the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, in my mind has proven that he can be a stable fantasy asset. Now, even though Deebo Samuel is not going to be active in tonight's game, they still have Ayuk, they still have Christian McCaffrey, George Kittle, and even more. There are going to be other options that step up, and in a Kyle Shanahan offense where all you need to do is get the ball into your playmakers' hands, I think this is a perfect position once again for Brock Purdy to be a relevant fantasy option, on top of the fact that he has the mobility to find the end zone in those specific scenarios in which maybe he needs to scramble, maybe no one's open. With that extra ability, continues to find more fantasy success, and in my mind, could potentially be started if you don't have any of these better options going into tonight's game. Let's move on to the final option. It is Tua Tagovailoa. The reason why I'm worried about Tua is because of last week's performance. Now, I don't know if he's going to duplicate that, but literally at one point in that game was 3 for 18 passing. And there was no other issues. I'm primarily just hesitant because I'm afraid of Tua killing our fantasy seasons. Now, he's gotten majority of us here because of that, recent streak of games where he was really good. But the performances that we've seen as of late, going up against Buffalo now, one of the better defenses in the National Football League, the last time these two teams played, Tua didn't play that great. Obviously, dealing with a back injury concussion, but still, at this current moment in time, I'm not 100% bought in on Tua. I could be convinced otherwise, but it's got to be a pretty good argument to get me ranking Tua higher than the current position. All right, that's going to cover it for me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Again, do not forget, after tonight's Thursday Night Football game, I will be live streaming on the channel. Again, if you guys do not have anybody playing in tonight's game and want to continue to play fantasy football and or picking more or less on given player statistics, be sure to check out PrizePicks. They currently have the 12 Days of Pickmas going on right now. And in specific, they have the misses clause going on where you can go ahead and get a protected play and get your $20 back if, in fact, you play tonight, putting together a potential entry. Use promo code Andrew. The link is down in the description. You can also download on your mobile device and go ahead and check it out there. Sign up, use promo code Andrew, and when you do so and make a first-time deposit, your first-time deposit is immediately doubled up to $100. Take advantage of that. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And until next time, later tonight or tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.